Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second seminar in our series on manufacturing sustainability. The Michigan Manufacturers Association and the Nature Conservancy are pleased to work together on this series on sustainability in the industrial sector. We believe it's very important for manufacturers to start thinking about sustainability and integrating that into their operations now. We anticipate that there will be public policies and actions that will drive manufacturers to adopt these sustainable practices in the near future. Of course, this is one more challenge at a time when you're facing labor shortages, global competition, and fallout from the ongoing pandemic. But thinking about it now and planning for the future will help you and your industry's peers stay competitive, and in the long run, prepare you for what's to come. For those of you unfamiliar with the Nature Conservancy, we're a global science-based conservation organization, and our mission is to protect the lands and waters on which we all depend. We're on the ground in over 70 countries and in every state in the United States. And in Michigan, we have over 50 employees, and we have nearly 40,000 acres under our stewardship. So you might be thinking, why would a conservation organization like TMC partner with the Michigan Manufacturers Association? We both believe that we want to encourage manufacturers to take the lead and participate in developing policies that will affect them. And because all manufacturers and industries are not alike, we have to find the most effective and practical solutions so that we are prepared for what's to come. During our first webinar that was held last month, Mary Roten, Ford's Sustainability Director, talked about Ford and their sustainability goals. And she talked also about how they partner with their suppliers. We also heard from Rachel Jones, who is at the National Association of Manufacturers, and she spoke about how manufacturers have progressed over time on their sustainability planning. Finally, we heard from Susan Fancy, who was at the University of Michigan's Global CO2 Institute, and she gave us a presentation on the trends in industrial carbon management technologies. Today, our panel will discuss challenges and opportunities coming up in government policy. Before I introduce our terrific panel, just a few logistics for our webinar. We'll have a few questions after each panelist speaks, and I invite you to use the Q&A function on Zoom. Please be sure to mention your name and your affiliation so that we can recognize you properly. We'll also be taking some polls during the session and welcome your participation in those polls. And finally, we're recording this event, and it will be available afterwards for you to share with your colleagues. Now let me introduce this panel. First, we'll have Director Liesl Clark. Director Clark leads the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. And in addition to this important role, she also chairs the Michigan Climate Solutions Council. And I hope she'll talk about some of the draft and participation that will be coming up. When Liesl Clark has held many roles, but she's one of the founding members of the Michigan Energy Innovation Council, Business Council. Next, we'll hear from Jason Albritton. He's the Nature Conservancy's Director of Climate and Energy Policy. Jason will give us an overview of the federal policies that are in play. And prior to joining TNC, Jason served as the Senior Policy Advisor to the United States Senate Committee on Environmental and Public Works. Gabrielle Habeeb manages the Industrial Innovation Initiative at the Great Plains Institute. And that is a coalition that's convened by the World Resources Institute and the Great Plains Institute. Gabrielle's focus will be on carbon management and solutions for industry in the Midwest. Just a quick note, Jason has to leave our panel at 11:30, so if we don't get through all your questions for him, we'll take them and we'll connect with Jason later and we'll get back to you. So Director Clark, let me welcome you and thank you for joining us.
Great, thank you, and appreciate the invitation to be with you all here today. And clearly don't know how to use the virtual workplace because I'm popping on my video on and off, so apologies for that. So I'm Liesl Clark. I really am glad to be with you all here today. And in 10 minutes or less, I'm going to tell you some of the things that are moving forward at the state level, and certainly look forward to questions as we go forward from there. So I just wanted to start by talking at a high level about priorities from the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy's perspective, because to me it really overlaps and is interwoven into why is it important to be thinking about these sustainability issues from a sector perspective. So I wanted to start thinking a bit about water infrastructure, because it's a place where we at Eagle in the state of Michigan have been really focused on making sure that we're continuing to improve our investments in that water infrastructure, because it serves all of you and it serves our 10 million residents in the state. We know that we need additional investment both on the clean water side to make sure that we've got the best quality water so that it's supporting us and all of our different uses, and importantly on the drinking water side so that it is supporting our residents and supporting our businesses in having that good quality drinking water. So the governor had proposed the My Healthy Water Plan earlier last year, and that had been a bit of a lodestone for us as we were thinking through what's the right place for investments and how should those investments really be made in a way that's going to advance what communities are doing. In addition to the proposal for the plan, then we started to see additional interest from a federal level playing out. And so the good news is those opportunities from a state and federal perspective are lining up in a way that's really going to support communities in the state of Michigan and support the economic development that's necessary and that relies on that water infrastructure as a foundation. And so that's why I wanted to mention that in particular. And I also wanted to mention that we have seen obviously a lot of dollars from the federal perspective invested in states. We're really excited and anxious to get those dollars out the door and make sure that they're working in communities. And so there was 10 billion of the ARP dollars allocated to the state, and there's 5 billion that is still to be allocated through the state legislature. And so we're very interested in working closely with the legislature to see how those dollars can support certainly water infrastructure, and then also other sustainability initiatives that end up really advancing what you all are doing on an everyday basis. Now, since the ARP dollars were allocated, there's also the bipartisan infrastructure legislation that's in place now as well. So we know a structure there because the way that those dollars were allocated, they went through existing funding models. So the benefit there is we know that the dollars are going to flow through programs that are going to get to communities through the Safe Drinking Water revolving funds, as well as the Clean Water Drinking Revolving Fund, or Clean Water Revolving Fund, excuse me, to really get those dollars to hit the ground. At the same time, there will be additional dollars that will be flowing through the state energy program, as well as through energy efficiency conservation block grants, and some dollars around orphan well cleanup and hard rock mining that we're working through as a team to figure out how to support allocation and appropriation of those dollars. So just wanted to mention how some of those dollars are moving, because it's really important that policy match up with the dollars that are available. When I look towards the department itself and I think about the work that we have to do to strengthen the department, one of the things that I think about is making sure that we have an adequate amount of FTEs so that we are supporting what is happening from an economic development perspective, as well as supporting moving permits in and out the door effectively and efficiently. So that is something that's really on my mind a lot, making sure that we are keeping those timelines as timely as possible so that things are not getting stuck on the department side in helping, as we're seeing more and more on the economic development side, supporting existing companies in the private sector as well as expansions. And I did want to mention too that an exciting piece that demonstrates the progress around shared improvement around our air resource is that the Southeast Michigan ozone attainment redesignation was sent in just recently to EPA, which is really good news for regional air quality, and will help us avoid bump up concerns in the Southeast Michigan area. Now, we know that while that's true, we still have a lot of work to do with local emissions, particularly on air toxics. But that's something that we certainly are interested in working on together and making a difference on together, and will help us as we're all talking about how to move forward our sustainability goals. And then before I switch my attention over to the My Healthy Climate Plan, I did want to also mention an emphasis from Eagle's perspective, making sure that we're making progress on contaminated site cleanup. This is a pretty healthy list of locations across the state of Michigan that, we certainly from a state perspective have a responsibility, as well as in the cases where there's a responsible party, there's certainly a responsibility there to make sure that we are making improvements and shrinking that list of contaminated sites. Of course, attention there helps us further down the stream, make sure we're not having clean water issues and drinking water issues in locations where, it's something that we can instead handle at the contaminated site. So as is true on the climate perspective, this is also true in the contaminated site perspective, as well as, the PFAS world. Any place where we can get to, we're moving upstream to finding out, what the source of the challenge is and then dealing with the source. It's going to result in a lot less dollars spent, less emergency dollars spent down the road. So we already heard a couple of times about the My Healthy Climate Plan. Just to give you a brief overview, the department did release a draft of the My Healthy Climate Plan last Friday, sent it to the governor. We are now entering a period where we'll be taking public comment on that plan, and so really interested in working with folks to make sure that the council as well as the department gets lots of feedback on that plan. While we were getting ready for this panel offline, we even talked amongst panelists about the work group effort that the council embarked on last year. So just to give you a really quick synopsis of that, the council met 14 times last year, all virtually. I'm super enthusiastic about getting face-to-face again as quickly as safely possible. But there were virtual meetings, which does allow for a lot of input from further flung places, which is certainly one of the benefits on the virtual world. 14 meetings, there were 5 work groups that the council broke out into. Those work groups had, frankly, hundreds of participants and hundreds of recommendations. And so what the council and the department worked together on was pulling those recommendations together. And what you'll see in the plan, if you take a minute to look at it, is we're working to lift up the recommendations that came out of the work group and then focus on key recommendations that I like to say are the big rocks that are really necessary to get us to our decarbonization goals in the future. You can find all these materials at michigan.gov/climate if you're interested, and we're working to do some briefer summaries in order to help direct people to what they might be interested in. From a private sector, from an MMA perspective, what you may be interested in are the work group sessions that were on large energy users. And so that in particular, I think, was a really good conversation about what's necessary from a sustainability perspective and a decarbonization perspective. So just a couple of highlights. Certainly an emphasis on energy waste reduction. And I'm guessing those that are participating or listening to this are already thinking about what they can do and have perhaps already tackled a lot of low-hanging fruit. But of course, energy waste production is the first place to start. Then it was pretty clear it's a shift to low carbon fuels wherever possible, particularly for those heavy industry, heavy energy users. And then, we'll talk a bit about this more in the course of the discussion here today, but there's a chunk of innovation that we all know is really important yet too. You don't have a perfect roadmap to get us to 100% decarbonization. There will be work that's necessary, innovation that's necessary in order to get us the rest of the way. And that's a place where the state is going to work really closely with our friends at the federal level to capture all dollars we possibly can here to really emphasize that innovation component, because we think that Michigan companies are very passionate about sustainability. They really want that to happen. And we want that to happen here. We want that innovation to be developed here, so that, because we really think that if you're going to do it in the rest of the country, you got to do it in Michigan first. So very interested in talking with all of you about that and getting feedback on the My Healthy Climate Plan. So with that, I think I went a minute or two over, and I apologize, but really looking forward to the continued conversation here and frankly to hearing from the rest of my panelists. So thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. And a reminder to everyone participating to please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A function. So first I have that obviously everyone is looking forward to reading the Michigan Healthy Climate Plan. Can you speak a little bit about how we may anticipate it being implemented?
Yes, so the plan going forward, first I want to say that it's really important that documents like this are iterative and are living documents. So what you saw, the version that came out last week is certainly a draft, needs a lot of input. We're looking forward to the input now as we go into this public listening session. The council then is going to shift into quarterly meetings. So the council will, still be a wonderful advisory component for this work going forward. And then the department will be creating implementation groups around particular topic areas. And so working on that in partnership with the council. One of the things that you saw throughout the council's work and throughout the department's work is that we absolutely know that we can't do this on our own and that all the solutions do not lie with government. We think it's really critical that we stand on the important foundation of sustainability work that's happened in the private sector already and support and aggregate that work. So what we did with the work groups was we had a state of Michigan co-chair with a non-state of Michigan co-chair. We thought that was really important to make sure that there was outside perspective, stakeholder perspective informing this work. The same thing is necessary for the implementation group. So while the state will think about what those categories are and certainly work with outside stakeholders about what that is, we also think that the implementation groups need to be seasoned pretty heavily with external parties in order to really be successful at what we're going to do going forward. And then, I love the Eisenhower quote, which I really should look up so that I do it correctly, but plans aren't worth the paper they're written on. The point is the planning. So the point is that we need to come together and be talking regularly about what we're doing going forward. And we need to be nimble. Just because it's, written down on a piece of paper, a couple of months ago doesn't mean it's the right thing to do as this sort of innovation map lays out for us and as we get more information. So I'm certainly looking forward to working with anybody who's interested in being advisors in that effort going forward.
Great, thank you. We look forward to it as well. So far, one more question. Does Eagle offer any workshops to help manufacturers assess their carbon footprint?
So we have tons of workshops. I can't give you all of them off the top of my head, but while someone else is speaking, I'll make sure to enter the workshop link into the Q&A chat. And certainly, if we haven't done one on that topic, that's certainly something we would want to do one on. So happy to, get that feedback and give that to our team as we're developing additional curriculum. So always interested in working, certainly with MMA and other industry groups about how we can best support the type of programming that your members are interested in.
Great, thank you. And something I found very helpful is I've signed up for the agency's weekly calendar updates. So every Monday, if you sign up, you can see things that have been added. Obviously,
that's a great one. And you're reminding me, I should also mention to sign up for our blog. So that's another good, I'll put some links in the chat.
Yeah, it's super useful to expect that every Monday and have marked off what has been added. So thank you for that. All right, well, moving on to Jason. As Madhu had mentioned, Jason is the Director of Climate and Energy Policy for the Nature Conservancy's North America Policy and Government Relations Office. Jason leads the Conservancy's strategy to advance ambitious state and federal climate and energy policies that put the U.S. on a path to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Welcome, Jason.
Thanks so much. Thanks for inviting me to this really important discussion today. Looking forward to all the panelists' comments and appreciate what's been said so far. So I'm going to focus primarily on what's happening at the federal level and some recent policies. But before I get into that, I want to start with a little more background on why the Nature Conservancy cares about manufacturing sustainability and how that factors into our policy work. So I think I do have a few slides if those can be put up. If not, that's fine too, but I'll just walk through some of the background here. So So first, we're really largely approaching this issue through the lens of climate change, which we view as one of the greatest threats to our mission. And tackling this challenge is really a top priority for us as an organization. The science is very clear from our perspective. We need to reach net zero emissions by 2050. It's where we need to go as a nation and as a world if we're going to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So to date, a lot of attention has really been focused on reducing emissions in the electric utility sector, as well as in the transportation sectors of the economy. And these are the two largest sources of emissions in the country, but dealing with these two sectors alone will not solve the problem. We have to also focus on the industrial sector, which you can see some stats here about that. Because according to the International Energy Agency, global industrial emissions have to decline by 94% by 2050 to reach mid-century climate goals. So essentially nearly zero by that point in time. In the US in 2019, industrial emissions accounted for 23% of total US emissions, making it the third largest contributor. But after you factor in electricity use, industry is the largest. And all of you know the significant electricity needs of the industrial sector. So it's a really important part of this challenge of dealing with climate change. It's not like necessarily the other sectors of the economy, though, and I think that's also important to recognize, particularly as we're thinking about policy and how to design policy. The carbon emitting processes in the industrial sector are often much harder to address than power or transportation. The technologies needed to reduce some of these emissions are either non-existent, they're in the first stages of research, or not broadly deployed in the marketplace. And so that's a challenge that really has to be overcome if we're to achieve ambitious climate goals like net zero by 2050. And we really need to start that process now to set the stage to achieve these climate goals and achieve what we often call this last mile of decarbonization, some of those hardest to reduce emissions. A key part of this, and there's a couple of solutions that we're really focused on, some of which are more near term and some of which are more longer term. In the near term, use of nature's carbon sequestration processes will be a valuable part of the puzzle to solving this challenge, particularly in the short term as we work to develop the technologies needed to eliminate industrial emissions. TNC's own research shows that natural climate solutions, which is the term we use for forests and wetlands and grasslands' ability to store carbon, can provide more than a quarter of the emissions reductions we need to get to our climate goals. So it's a really important piece of the puzzle. As others, I think, previously mentioned, there's also significant opportunity in the near term to improve energy efficiency in industrial facilities, which has multiple benefits, not only reducing emissions and using less energy, but also lowering costs. And those are some near-term things that can be implemented now. But even with these solutions in place, they're not going to be enough to cover that last mile that I talked about. That's why we at the Nature Conservancy really support advancing innovation that can prevent greenhouse gases entering the atmosphere by developing new technologies. One of those technologies that we've really focused on, and I heard you said you heard a little bit about in your last webinar, is carbon capture, which is a promising solution for that really last mile of decarbonization. But the technology still needs more research, more development, and more financial support to reach the scale of the deployment that will be necessary. Again, referencing the International Energy Agency, they looked at scenarios that get us to 2 degrees Celsius of warming globally and found that carbon capture could play a really significant role in reducing emissions, particularly from industries where no other cost-effective way to decarbonize currently exists. So with that in mind, a lot more is needed to develop these technologies, investments needed in those technologies to ensure that energy-intensive industries can reduce their emissions while sustaining good-paying jobs. And that leads me to one of my last points, which I think is really important from our perspective, is that finding cost-effective ways to address emissions from the industrial sector is an economic imperative as well. Manufacturing in the US employs roughly 12.5 million workers, and it is critical that we maintain and even grow these high-wage jobs in the future. And the good news, I think, is that the US has the opportunity to be a global leader in developing some of the new technologies that are needed to create sustainable manufacturing. In addition, investment in these technologies can create additional manufacturing jobs. So that's a bright spot we want to focus on as we think about how to work in this space. So with that, I'm going to move into some of the details, and we can go to the next slide, of what's been happening, particularly at the federal level on policy around these issues. I'm going to focus on a couple of different big pieces of legislation that have passed or are being considered right now and talk about some of the policies that have been included there. So first, I'm going to start with the Energy Policy Act of 2020, which passed last in December of 2020. A really important bill, first energy bill of its size and scope in nearly a decade to pass Congress, and had broad bipartisan support. It included a particular program that I want to call out that was part of another piece of legislation introduced by a bipartisan group of members called the Clean Industrial Technology Act. And that creates a new and comprehensive and cross-cutting program at the federal level, really focused on industrial technologies, R&D to advance those technologies, and helping to lower the cost of some of these technologies for cleaner chemicals, materials, and manufacturing. And it really is an attempt to get a lot of different federal agencies involved in tackling this challenge. It also includes a technical assistance program to help manufacturers that are looking to make improvements in their operations so that some of those things that are ready to move now can start moving forward. Another important piece of legislation that Director Clark talked about is the bipartisan infrastructure bill that just passed Congress in November, also called the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This had a number of different programs. You see a few highlighted here on the slide that relate to manufacturing sustainability. It created a new program at the Department of Energy focused on supporting battery manufacturing and recycling, and building out electric vehicle supply chains. So more investment in that technology. It also included a new advanced energy manufacturing grant program that can support new facilities or retrofits of existing facilities to produce or recycle advanced energy products in communities with a particular focus where there was a former coal mine or coal power plant that has since retired. And the focus of that program is to try to bring new manufacturing jobs in some of these new technologies to areas that have lost jobs or have lost facilities that were previously in coal production. There's also a new program to provide funding for institutions of higher education to identify opportunities to optimize energy efficiency and environmental performance at manufacturing and industrial facilities. This new program also creates a new grant to fund upgrades at small and medium-sized manufacturers that have been recommended in one of these assessments that are authorized by the program. The bill also expands DOE's, the Department of Energy's existing loan program for advanced vehicle technologies to include medium and heavy duty vehicles, trains, aircraft, and maritime vessels. So expanding an existing program to more types of advanced vehicle technologies across the transportation sector. And then I'm sure, as you'll hear more about in one of the subsequent presentations, the bill creates and invests $8 billion in clean hydrogen hubs to really try to advance, demonstrate, and build a robust clean hydrogen economy. It also puts significant investment in a new loan program to building out carbon capture infrastructure and investing in those pipelines and other transport infrastructure that is needed to get carbon, once it's captured, to places for permanent sequestration. So it's an important part of that carbon capture puzzle that I was talking about earlier. So we can go on to the next slide. I'm going to finally just touch on, in the last minute or so here, a bill that has not yet become law, but has been under active debate in Congress over the last few months, and that's the administration's Build Back Better proposal. This is a significant piece of legislation that it tackles a number of topics, but there are a few specific pieces related to manufacturing sustainability that I want to call out. One is that it has significant funding for rebates for energy efficiency and electrification investments. And a lot of that is focused on the residential, but it also includes eligibility for industrial facilities to get a federal rebate back for those types of investments. It also has a large clean energy tax package, over $300 billion in tax incentives, but it includes a number of specific new and revamped tax credits that definitely apply to the issues we're talking about today. One is a reform tax credit for advanced energy technologies in the manufacturing sector that covers up to 30% of the cost of those investments, and it includes investments related to manufacturing of renewable energy components, electric vehicle components, as well as investments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from existing industrial manufacturing facilities. An important note about this program is that it also includes a set-aside, at least in the current version of the legislation, for automotive-related manufacturing, $4 billion for those types of projects. So a significant investment there in advanced manufacturing technologies. The bill also includes a long-term extension of the 45Q tax credit for carbon capture, which is really an important program for driving investments in carbon capture, and new tax credits for clean hydrogen, both the production tax credit and an investment tax credit of 30%. So there's a lot here. I didn't go into a lot of detail, but just want to give you a snapshot of the significant policy discussion at the federal level and a lot of the different moving pieces that are trying to address some of these issues. So with that, I'm going to pause there and I'm happy to take a question or two if you have one about what's happening.
Thank you, Jason. So speaking of the Build Back Better plan, can you speak a little bit about what you expect its prospects to be in 2022?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's really uncertain. There was a lot of discussion in Congress last year. Towards the end of the year, it was clear they didn't have the votes for the package that they were trying to move forward. And so I think discussions continue into the new year to try to move that forward. While the bill, as it was drafted, at the end of last year, likely won't become law as is, there's an ongoing discussion about what components of that have brought enough support to move forward. And I think some of those things that I just highlighted, particularly about some of the manufacturing related tax credits, I think those have a lot of broad support, and pieces like that might be able to be pulled out and move forward as part of a smaller package in the coming months.
All right. Yeah, I love hearing an update every single day on the news about it. All right. And then another question, are there any federal incentives for locating renewables on brownfield redevelopment sites or similar areas?
Yeah, thanks for that question. This is an issue that the Nature Conservancy has done a lot of work on because we see a lot of opportunity to redevelop brownfield sites for renewable energy deployment. And the tax credit package that I mentioned in my presentation has a lot of investment in renewable energy tax credits, but it also has a provision that was added towards the end of the year that we worked very diligently on to create an additional incentive on top of the existing tax credit if you put that renewable energy on a brownfield site or a degraded site like a former mine land. And that helps close that cost gap that often exists to developing those sites and can spur renewed economic development, also meet clean energy goals in some of these brownfield sites, mineland sites, and other sites that we have around the country. So we're hopeful that that type of provision can move forward and will ultimately make it into law.
Great. Yeah, sounds like a great opportunity. All right. Well, thank you, Jason. Next up, we have Gabrielle, a policy expert on industrial decarbonization issues for the Industrial Innovation Initiative of the Great Plains Institute. So the Industrial Innovation Initiative is also known as I3. I3 is an ambitious coalition of co-convened members by GPI and the World Resources Institute to advance decarbonization solutions for the Midcontinent region's most important industrial sectors. Welcome, Gabrielle.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks to my fellow panelists. I've already learned a lot today. I also had a few slides, if we wouldn't mind queuing those up. I am also a very visual person. But yeah, my name is Gabrielle, and as Carolyn said, I'm the project manager for the Industrial Innovation Initiative, or I3. Our project brings together stakeholders from industry, labor, environmental NGOs, and state officials to really focus on advancing industrial decarbonization solutions. We do this in a number of ways, but our primary focus is on state and federal policy development and implementation that reduces industrial emissions overall. So we prioritize policies that advance the demonstration and adoption of technological solutions. We look at spurring market development and supporting good industrial jobs. Historically, I'll say that we've been more focused on federal policy advocacy just because that's where we saw a lot of the opportunities. But as some of these larger bills have been passing, we've got new opportunities to help support implementation at the state level, which is very exciting. I'm also happy to share my screen if the slides aren't working. Let me know. Oh, there it is. Okay. So because of our focus on industry, we've been primarily engaging with the Midwestern and Gulf Coast states. You can see those in yellow here that make up the Midcontinent region. And we do that because it's home to the region's greatest concentration of industrial production in the US. So we see it as having the greatest potential for reducing industrial emissions overall. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. All right, so This might be review from last month's webinar. I'm not entirely sure what everyone covered, but I wanted to take a moment here to discuss the kinds of carbon emissions that we're seeing coming from industry, as well as the opportunities that we have to mitigate those emissions. So as you're all totally aware, despite the wide variety of industries, products, and processes within this sector, we do tend to break down the emissions into a few sources. So we break them out into direct emissions and indirect emissions. The direct emissions happen on site and they come from both fuel combustion for electricity or heat and from process emissions that are generated through the chemical transformations going on to create the actual product. Indirect emissions, which make up about a quarter of industrial emissions overall, are primarily from off-site power generation. And as the power sector decarbonizes and the electric grid gets greener through things like renewables, indirect emissions are going to be less of a concern for industry when we have the direct emissions to deal with. So I3 doesn't focus on indirect emissions as much. Instead, we see our best opportunities to decarbonize on the within the fence line direct emission sort of sector there. So as I've noted in these yellow boxes, there are several cross-cutting solutions that can actually apply across sectors. So they aren't specific to any one industry. They're more specific to the source of emissions. So first, we're looking to decarbonize that fuel combustion, which makes up the majority of on-site emissions, as you can see in that darker blue. And so we're looking primarily at the solutions in that first box. That includes increasing energy efficiency, so less energy is just needed overall. Electrification wherever possible, so we can use fewer fossil fuels on site, especially for those industrial processes that just don't require high heat. And then lower zero carbon hydrogen for the places that we can't electrify. So those are the industrial processes that do require very high heat often. That remaining quarter down at the bottom of on-site emissions, those are process emissions. So those are nearly impossible to avoid on the front end just because their emissions stem from the chemical and physical transformations themselves. And so that's where carbon management comes in. And that's typically your carbon capture, usage, storage. And as Jason mentioned, we've been primarily in the early pilot stages with a lot of those technologies. So scaling up carbon management and deploying carbon capture widely across industries is going to be the next step we need to actually reach those climate goals. Next slide, please. All right, so last fall, I3 released a policy blueprint that outlined each of those cross-cutting decarbonization opportunities I mentioned, along with some policies that'll add market support for industry leaders as they create those lower carbon products. So our participants decided that carbon management, electrification, hydrogen, energy efficiency, procurement standards, and then innovative approaches, which links back to the innovation that Director Clark was noting. Those were the primary policy issues that we wanted to prioritize in our advocacy. At nearly the same time last year, we did see the infrastructure bill pass, which was really exciting for several reasons because a lot of these priorities got significant federal funding. This did open the door for some implementation work as well as ongoing advocacy to really boost those recommendations that were included in our blueprint and that our industry participants prioritized, but maybe didn't make it into the law. So there's still a lot of room for advocacy, but now we can actually do some of the implementation as well, which is the exciting stuff. Next slide, please. Okay, so here the font's a little small, but I laid out some of the most relevant provisions to industrial decarbonization under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. In particular, carbon management, energy efficiency, and hydrogen provisions came away with more than $22 billion over a 5-year period. So these provisions include money for carbon capture and hydrogen project demonstration and deployment, money for energy efficiency assessments for industrial facilities, as well as some smart manufacturing funds. It fully funded the SCALE Act, which supports financing for carbon transport and storage infrastructure, as well as those direct air capture and hydrogen hubs that Jason mentioned as well. And that's just to name a few. So we do have a fact sheet, which I can pop in the chat and maybe circulate afterwards, that goes into each of these provisions and what they mean for industry in a little bit greater detail. But nevertheless, I did want to focus on the carbon and hydrogen hubs briefly, because those have been of significant interest to states. And so I just wanted to talk about them a little bit more over on the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so this is an image from an upcoming report by GPI. It should be released early February, so sometime next month. And so this is just sort of a sneak peek, but in the full report, we map out places where each of the guiding criteria are met across the US to determine where the best locations might be for a carbon or hydrogen hub. These criteria include things like a high concentration of industrial emitters, existing transport infrastructure, presence of facilities that qualify for the 45Q tax credit, and others as they are listed on the left there. And then in the report, all of these are mapped on separate maps that culminate into this final gray map that it's on this slide. And it shows 13 areas where we see the greatest potential to host one of these hubs, either carbon or hydrogen. As you can see, I have circled the Great Lakes region in red because this area and Southeast Michigan in particular is especially prime for this kind of investment. It has the most number of those overlapping criteria and really seems like one of the smartest places to leverage this federal funding. So this is the kind of analysis that I3 tends to do and that we think might help industry and state stakeholders really engage with these new laws and make the most of the opportunity for federal funding. Next slide, please. So going forward, we are going to continue to conduct this kind of research and analysis to fill in the knowledge gaps and answer questions about new legislation and technology that are raised up by our participants. We have historically focused on federal action, but with the passage of the infrastructure bill and parts of the Build Back Better agenda potentially moving, there are a lot of opportunities for us to advance implementation of those policies at the state level. So we'll be shifting our focus a little bit to look at state level advocacy. And so if you do want to be looped in on the industry related policies and research, we have federal legislative tracking that relates to industry. And we also circulate a monthly newsletter that rounds up all of the relevant industry news and policies. So if you're interested in receiving either of those publications, you can definitely sign up through me via email or at our website. But I tried to go quick because I know we were a few minutes behind. That's it for me. I think the next slide has my email. Yep, that's me. So feel free to ask any questions, and thanks so much for the time.
All right, thank you. First question is, would you speak about what kind of industries or manufacturing processes are the most difficult to decarbonize? Definitely.
So I think that the trick with industry is that because of the variety of industries within that umbrella, it's really precluding one size fits all solutions. So even if you have, two cement manufacturers, you might have two completely different solution sets for the same, kind of manufacturing. And I think that in and of itself is probably the trickiest thing. That's why I3 does try to find those cross-cutting solutions that we can advocate for as a group to, throw a lot of weight behind, a particular solution. But I really do think that it's not that one industry is going to be all that more challenging than the other. It's that every single industry is going to have unique challenges. Though there are, the more significantly hard to abate sectors, but I unfortunately think that maybe most of industry falls under that umbrella.
Sure, understandable. And can you offer more details on how a carbon hub would work?
Yeah, so I think the idea behind the carbon hubs is that it would be more of a one-stop shop. So where you see, like the criteria call out, where you see a lot of emitting sectors or emitting facilities where there is that pipeline infrastructure already in place, or where there are, barge connections, are you on a river, really looking for those places where we can do the most in one location, almost like an airline hub, how you have, that central location and then it spreads out from there. So it's not to say that if you don't have a carbon or hydrogen hub, that's very tricky to say. In one place, you won't have connections to those infrastructure. It's just that it'll be centrally located and then, you know, spread out from that central location.
All right. All right. Well, thank you so much, Gabrielle. I really appreciate your time. So again, I'm Caroline Liesl, MMA's Director of Environmental and Regulatory Policy. I want to encourage you to put your questions into the chat or Q&A buttons. Also, I see a manufacturing sustainability poll just popped up, so please feel free to answer that as well. And then I will get to the questions in a moment. First, let me say how much we welcome and appreciate this chance to partner with the Nature Conservancy to find ways for our manufacturers to deal with the coming pressures to address emissions from regulations, customers, and a younger labor force more committed to sustainability. I also want to thank Madhu, Liesl, Jason, and Gabrielle for being with us today. We plan to have a longer Q&A period to answer your questions in just a moment. From MMA's perspective, looking forward to the year to come, as we've heard discussed today, MMA will be engaging with Eagle on the rollout and implementation of the My Healthy Plan. We'll be reviewing the draft plan that was mentioned earlier with members and participating in public comment in the months to come. As a reminder, the council formed 5 advisory work groups to cover building and housing, energy-intensive industries, energy production, transmission, distribution and storage, natural working lands and forest products, and transportation and mobility. Also, MMA is engaging with Eagle on the incorporation of environmental justice considerations into the agency's decision-making process, including issuing and renewing permits. Eagle recently submitted a letter to the EPA requesting assistance with the development of environmental justice issues, including conducting a review of permits, enhancing Eagle's ability to evaluate air toxic concerns, and providing additional clarity to the states on implementing federal standards in environmental justice communities. So MMA looks forward to engagement on that for members to be able to anticipate expectations in their planning process moving forward. And finally, as Liesl mentioned, great news that based on 3 years of ambient air monitoring data showing attainment of the 2015 Ozone National Ambient Air Quality Standards, Eagle requested the EPA redesignate the Southeast Michigan area to attainment to those standards. So the request outlined the fulfillment of the requirements for 3 complete consecutive calendar years of quality assured air quality monitoring data to demonstrate attainment. And the request asserts that the improvement in air quality is due to permanent and enforceable reductions in emissions, not to temporarily adverse economic conditions or unusually favorable meteorology. So that was great news. But Eagle is also still moving forward with the development of draft rules in case the EPA denies this request, and for 3 counties in West Michigan that are expected to be bumped up to moderate non-attainment. So MMA has been and will continue to participate in work groups for potential control strategies for the anticipation of that bump up and possible denial of the request. So expecting a busy year to come. So again, thank you. Madhu will give us more information in a moment on coming sessions. Thank you very much for your participation. And now I will turn it over to Madhu.
Thank you, Caroline. I hope that all of our participants found these presentations insightful, and we really appreciate the hour that you've spent with us. As noted before, that we've recorded this session, and feel free to email Caroline if you're interested in sharing this video with some of your colleagues. We'll look forward to seeing you in February and March. Our February webinar will be held on Tuesday, February 15th at 8:30 a.m. and we'll feature some Michigan manufacturers and their stories about their sustainability journey. We'll be delighted to have Kristen Seaman, Chief Sustainability Officer at General Motors, join us. And we'll also have Kelly Preston, President of Capital Steel and Wire and Mason, give us a presentation on their work in sustainability. So to register for that session and the next one in March, please go to the events page on the Michigan Manufacturers Association website. And don't forget to fill out that poll. It'll help us plan for the future. And thank you so much. We'll see you in a month.